It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We have a chance now to speak with one of the winners of this year's Hillman Prize for Journalism in the Service of the Common Good, and with one of their judges, New York Times columnist Jamelle Bouie. We'll also ask Jamelle about a couple of his recent columns, the one called Trump is Fixated on 1896, and the one in which the headline asks, what is the left's theory of power? Our prize winner guest is University of Michigan law professor Michelle Adams, author of the book The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. Among other things, she also served on President Biden's commission on the Supreme Court. Jamelle, it's always great to have you on with us. And Professor Adams, congratulations on your Hillman Prize and welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Jamelle, for listeners who may know the Pulitzer Prize or the Nobel Prize, but not the Hillman Prize for journalism, would you, as one of their judges, do a little intro for those listeners?
Absolutely. The Hillman Prize honors Sidney Hillman, the great labor leader of the New Deal era. It is focused on books, magazine articles, news articles, radio journalism, video journalism, broadcast, all kinds of stuff. We award all kinds of stuff that is done with an eye towards the public good. And historically, the Hillman has gone to work, obviously, around labor, around civil rights, around questions of foreign policy, but again, all focused on the what is being done with the goal of pursuing the public good. The common good, and this year's the 76th Hillman Prizes. So the Hillman Foundation's been doing this for a minute.
So winners this year include Wired in the magazine category for its reporting called The Doge Takeover of the Federal Government, Doris Burke and Ginger Thompson from ProPublica in the category Reporting on Racial and Economic Justice. Their story was called Sick in a Hospital Town, and more, including Professor Adams for her book. In the book category, Jamelle, I'll stay with you so I don't ask Professor Adams to boast about herself. Why was her book, The Containment, worthy of a Hillman Prize?
Well, first of all, it is just a wonderfully written piece of nonfiction work. It's journalistic, it's academic, and it covers what we thought was kind of a vitally important history in question, which is both the history of school integration.
Did we lose Jamelle's line? Jamelle, you there? All right, we'll try to reconnect Jamelle. Professor Adams, are you there?
I am.
Good. So
I'll pick right up.
Everyone knows. Okay, go ahead and pick right up.
So I can talk a little bit about the book while we're trying to reconnect. First of all, I just want to reiterate what an incredible honor it is to receive this award. I never in a million years dreamed that I would. My book is an opportunity to try to have a conversation and to invite as many people as possible into my constitutional law classroom, but to tell a story in a way that's broadly accessible about a moment in time in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when we had a chance to integrate both our schools and our neighborhoods, and why that didn't happen, and sort of the travel up to the Supreme Court, what happened to the Supreme Court when we got there, and a little bit about what happened after we left. So it's really the story of a litigation that took place in my hometown, Detroit, Michigan, where we, a group of really brilliant and talented lawyers brought a case against the school authorities, both state and local, and they alleged that there had been discrimination in the public schools in Detroit. And the really interesting thing about this in 1970 was that everybody sort of was focused on what was going on in the South, and suddenly now we had the question of whether you could establish a Brown violation in the North. And so my book is about that story, and it's told from the perspective of many incredibly interesting characters and people. And I had an opportunity to interview a bunch of folks who have now since passed, and so it was really a labor of love for me.
Yeah, I guess we could say everyone knows Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court intended to desegregate schools in the South in 1954. Not so many know about Milliken versus Bradley, which I think you'll say perpetuated segregation in the North in 1974. Is that
Correct.
A decent way to put it?
I think it is. I think that everyone's taught about Brown, at least a little bit about Brown, and then all the knowledge kind of just falls off. Whatever happened to Brown? And so some folks maybe know, sort of can trace that in the South. But what happens when you have effectively what lawyers call de jure by law segregation in the North, but there were no state laws that required it? Was it impossible then to actually have a Brown violation? And it turned out that in the North, what we were doing was we were segregating our schools, but we were using different kinds of methods. And so really what the book is about, it's about Northern Jim Crow. We had a nationwide policy of Jim Crow, but we sort of had regional variations. And so my book is about the Northern variation of that. And what's so amazing about the trial in this case that led up to the Milliken versus Bradley case in 1974, and what I didn't know when I first started researching it, but I learned as I did, was that a group of lawyers in downtown Detroit in the early 1970s basically put Northern Jim Crow on trial, and they basically showed how both housing and school segregation were perpetuated and were created in the North. And it was just a moment in time where you get a trial court judge who is really suspicious of their case, and then by the time they're done, ends up becoming one of the nation's loudest voices in favor of school desegregation. So it was an opportunity to tell that story.
The Hillman Prize people say you show how that case shaped an enduring resistance to affirmative action and civil rights reforms. Would you draw that line for us from Milliken versus Bradley in 1974 at the Supreme Court to the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC case from 2023 or anything else?
So that case was decided in 2023. I think there's a relationship between the school desegregation cases and the affirmative action cases. And in my classroom, we talk about them in the same section of the course. But the point, I think the way that there's really a relationship is just that when we get to the Supreme Court and when the trial judge had decided that the state of Michigan and the city had violated the Equal Protection Clause, and when he decided that the best way, excuse me, to remedy that was to have a metropolitan wide school desegregation order that would have affected about 50 different school districts across southeastern Michigan, including Detroit. When we get to the Supreme Court sort of ignores all of the things that happened below, and it doesn't really take up the idea of Northern Jim Crow. And it really does kind of put back sort of this idea that we're going to have race-conscious remedies, and puts them on the back foot. And I think that's where you can begin to see this sort of leak into other areas of the law, including affirmative action.
Listeners, anyone out there who read Professor Adams' book or wants to say or ask anything about the case, Milliken versus Bradley, and its relevance today, or her book, The Containment, or anything you always wanted to ask Jamelle Bouie after reading one of his columns, but you never had him over for dinner, 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. Call or text. Jamelle is back with us now. Jamelle, just on the issue, supporters of the 2023 decision and the current anti-DEI movement would say people should be judged on the content of their characters and not grouped by the color of their skin. The same argument that was used against Jim Crow, they would say. How would you respond?
So two things. The first, just with regards to the book, I wanted to add before I got dropped there, that part of the reason we wanted to award the book is precisely because there seems to be further retrenchment in the present day from the goal of an integrated society. And I think telling this particular story helps illuminate that. As for responding to that claim, I think what I would say is that the aim of civil rights laws, the aim of integration and desegregation wasn't simply to treat people by their character, but to end systems of subordination, right? To end systems of subordination, to end systems that group people by class and then put them at the lowest level of society. And so I often think that response to, say, affirmative action programs, to DEI or whatever, is somewhat missing the point. It's sort of almost a non sequitur, right? We're not talking about judging people not by their character. We're talking about being attentive to the legacies of subordination in this country and looking for ways to deal with those legacies of subordination. And that does actually mean recognizing who was subordinated.
Professor Adams, your book is specifically about that case in Detroit, where, as you say, you come from. Listener writes a text question: how did this impact New York City? Do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, the book really does take place between around 1968 and 1974 in Detroit. And so it's very much a story that's rooted in Detroit. So it doesn't speak specifically to what happened in New York City. I think it is, though, a general question, a general approach to thinking about northern desegregation and northern segregation and northern Jim Crow. So obviously, New York's in the north, Michigan's in the north. And so some of the same kinds of techniques that we saw were used to segregate the schools in the city of Detroit were common across the North, including New York.
You served, I see, on President Biden's Supreme Court commission. Do
I
you think
did.
the court needs reform in some way that serves everyone, or Republicans would argue that people on the left just want to change the court now because they've been losing a lot lately?
I think that there's a long history of people who, feel that the Supreme Court doesn't have their ear wanting to change the court. There's nothing really new about that. If you go back to 1937, FDR had a court packing plan that he put before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it died there. So this is nothing new. I mean, to be honest, I think the way that I would think about this is to step back and think, how did we get into this situation to begin with? And the answer is we have to win elections, right? And the focus has to be on winning presidential elections and winning the Senate, right? Because the Senate is what controls, the Senate controls the federal judiciary. And it's not just the Supreme Court. What we want to be doing is making sure that there's good political control there. And so I'm sort of less focused on what are the different kinds of things that you might be able to do constitutionally now to be able to
Hmm.
express displeasure with the Supreme Court. And what I want to do is sort of refocus the conversation and making sure that that elections are won so that you can get you have that that both parties have equal opportunity to be able to place nominees on the Supreme Court as well as the lower federal courts, which are vitally important.
So, Jamel, let me use that as a segue to your recent column called "What is the Left's Theory of Power?" What do you mean by theory of power?
In the context of that piece, I'm talking about its sort of theory of constitutional power and constitutional authority. How does it envision what the Constitution is as a political document? Does it have a particular constitutional vision that it hopes to instantiate? The political right certainly does. It has this kind of executive forward, almost, Smithian vision.
Whoops. I think you accidentally muted yourself, Jamel. Can you hear me? Can you unmute?
I do not know why I keep muting myself. But does to continue, does the left have any kind of vision for what it wants the constitutional order to be? That's sort of the question of the piece. And I'm kind of riffing off of a really interesting piece in the Law and Political Economy website blog that is sort of thinking through this question as well and looking at the deficiencies of the current sort of constitutional order.
So you argue that the right has a theory of constitutional power and the left does not. Would you compare and contrast a little specifically for our listeners?
Sure, and I would say I'm not sure. It's not so much that I'm sure. It's not so much that I think the left doesn't. It's just that I'm not sure it's a question that's sort of live, right? Like not that many people, I think, on the political left are thinking about it in a serious way. But if I had to kind of identify the political rights theory of the Constitution, I think we can see it in action, which is this notion that the president, the executive, isn't simply one officer among many, an important one, a prominent one, but not someone who has sort of overweening authority over the entire executive branch, but the president as sort of the singular focus of the executive branch. He is the executive branch. He embodies it, and thus has the right to effectuate his will over the entire executive branch, to determine, according to his political judgment, what every part of the executive branch does, even if Congress disagrees, even if Congress is mandated differently via statute. And this vision of the executive is in turn against, I think, what conservatives view as the parts of the American state that shouldn't be there to begin with. The administrative state, the legacy of the New Deal, the regulatory state, civil rights enforcement, They are making kind of two arguments that this is the role of the president, and additionally, because the president, in their view, embodies the entire will of the nation, that president thus has the right to make these sweeping changes in unilateral fashion.
Yeah.
The interesting thing I'll say about the piece I was riffing off is the observation that there is a little bit of this right inherent in the New Deal vision, in that you can almost understand Trump and his actions as kind of taking that, turning it to 11, and using it for the purposes of the political right. And so one of the questions is, can you go back? Is the New Deal vision actually something you have to move past? Recognize its contributions, but think differently about what you want the locus of power to be in the constitutional system.
More Congress, less president. And your other relevant column that I want to ask you about, recent column, they're all relevant, is the one called Trump is Fixated on 1896. Now, some of our listeners may already know that he likes William McKinley, who was elected president that year, largely because McKinley was a tariffs guy. That conversation was circulating last year. What was new to me in your column is that you bring the Iran war and the Venezuela invasion into the 1896 McKinley frame. Would you make that case for our listeners?
Sure. This is a period where we see kind of the first real flourishing is the wrong word for this, but I can't think of a better one, of American imperialism. Under McKinley, the United States fights the Spanish-American War, is taking territory in Cuba, in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, is engaged in imperial expansion, reaching out to Japan, to China, to open markets in an imperial fashion. Right, this is the age of the beginnings of American imperialism. And I really do think that even if Trump is not cognizant of this, although I think he might actually be, the coincidences are too strong. But even if Trump isn't cognizant of it, it is again, it's like a reflection of his preoccupation with like the late 19th century in American life. I'll say about that piece, some of it was me being a little tongue in cheek, just with the president's conflict with the Pope, because just it's funny to me that in addition to these more substantive things, you have this sort of faint echo of nativist anti-clericism happening with the administration.
Listener writes, Mr. Bowie is always interesting, illuminating, and insightful. I wanted to know if he's a political scientist, but I've never had him over for dinner and haven't been able to ask. Now you're asked.
I'm not a political scientist by training. I have a bachelor's degree. I went to college, of course, but I studied political theory and religious studies. These days, I'm just a guy who reads a lot of books.
And Professor Adams, I gave Jamel the chance to comment on your work that won the Hillman Prize for Journalism in the Public Interest for your book. Is there anything that you, as a law professor who is steeped in history, think readers can learn from reading Jamel, a New York Times current affairs columnist who is steeped in history?
Oh, I think you need to make sure that you've got your subscription updated to the New York Times. I think it's essential reading. And so I'm so glad for the work that Jamel's doing. I can't point to any particular column, but I think that they're all incredibly useful. I think also the focus on this question of the Constitution and sort of the vision that the left might have for the Constitution. Of course, that's sort of, that's music to my ears. It's one of the things that I think a lot about, and sort of what do we want to see happening? I go back to sort of the comment I made earlier about the importance of democracy. It's, I don't disagree about the idea that the right has a very kind of aggressive sort of a unitary executive theory, but on steroids. I agree with that. But I also think when we're thinking about sort of constitutional theory and what we would like to have happen, we have to, the notion that we want to sort of, whoever the president is, whether the president is President Trump or President Biden or President Obama, it typically is not a good idea to have something approaching an imperial presidency. And so getting the House and the Senate back into the business of actually exercising the constitutional powers that they enjoy, as opposed to sort of ceding power to the executive, is incredibly important. And that has been important. That's a through line, whether it's Republican presidents or Democratic presidents. So in terms of thinking about where we want to be in terms of the Constitution, and whether it's left or right, I think what we want to do is focus on democracy. And when we cede that much power to the executive, it undercuts our fundamental commitments to the democratic process.
Jamel, one more for you before we go from a listener. I'll give context to say that people who read you regularly, your column and your newsletter, know that besides, the opinion column, you list things that you're reading, and you even share recipes. So a listener writes, JB is the best journalist writing today, and asks, what are JB's favorite movies? Got anything for that listener?
Sure. Yeah. Someone actually recently asked me this as well, and I have it for top of mind. So my favorite movies kind of like change from time to time, but for a while now, when I think about it, I have four answers. The first, I'll give you four. The first is Sidney Lumet's Serpico. The next is Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ. The next is Frankenheimer's The Manchurian Candidate. And the final is Orson Welles' The Touch of Evil, or Touch of Evil.
You did have those top of mind. You want to take any one and say why, then we're out of time?
Absolutely, sure. Serpico is, Sidney Lumet, famous New Yorker, has a wide and varied filmography, not thought of as being an auteur, thought of very much as being kind of an actor's director. But I love Serpico amongst his many, many excellent films because it's ostensibly about police corruption, but it really is about what it means and what it costs to have a cause, to have a passion, to have something that you cannot let go of, that you have to pursue no matter the cost to your own life and your own livelihood and well-being. And I think that, I myself am just like fascinated by that kind of exploration of the personality type of a kind of person who is seized with a cause. You see some of that in The Last Temptation as well. All these movies are about people who are seized with something that they can't quite shake. But Serpico is the one that I really go to again and again.
Well, listeners, there's our conversation with one of the winners of this year's Hillman Prize for Journalism in the Service of the Common Good, and with one of their judges. The winner was University of Michigan law professor Michelle Adams, who authored the book The Containment: Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. The judge was New York Times columnist Jamelle Bouie. We really appreciate both of you coming on with us for this, and Professor Adams, congratulations again.
Thank you very much.